At the end of the 1970s, there were more than 500 Friendly's restaurants spread across the Northeast United States. And if you were a kid growing up in America from 1965 to 2000, you almost certainly sat in one of those booths at least once. Maybe in 1978, maybe in 1986, or maybe on a Sunday night in 1994 that you don't remember the exact date of, but you remember the feeling so clearly. And you still remember the moment the glass door opened with the light metallic ring of a bell. A small sound you didn't notice at the time but that sank deep into your memory later. A sound that repeated thousands of times every day at every store. And the instant you stepped inside you felt the change, not just in the air, but in the whole environment. A rush of cold from the ice cream freezers and air conditioning hitting your skin, so different from the summer heat outside. And in the air was the sweet smell of freshly baked waffle cones mixed with hot chocolate syrup and a hint of caramel sugar. A scent you couldn't describe exactly, but you knew immediately where you were, and in front of you were rows of red booths stretching along the windows, the vinyl seats slightly sticky on those hot, humid July days, the white laminate tables with rounded edges worn down after millions of family meals over 2 decades from 1970 to 1990, with little scratches no one noticed but that were evidence of everyone who had sat there before you, and you slid into the seat, the tabletop slightly cool, and a server, maybe a college student working the evening shift, walked over and set down a thick, colorful menu full of pictures of tall sundaes, thick milkshakes, and elaborately decorated birthday cakes. And she smiled and said, "Do you guys already know what you want, or do you need a few more minutes?" And of course you needed a few more minutes. Because even though you had been there dozens of times, you still spent time flipping through every page, looking at every picture, weighing a Jim Dandy sundae against a banana split, while your dad looked at his watch then at you and said half-jokingly, "You've been picking that one for 10 years now," and you replied, "But today I want to try something different," even though you knew you would end up ordering the usual anyway, and then the food came. Not right away, but after a wait just long enough to build anticipation, and when it was set down you paused for a second because that sundae looked bigger than you remembered. A tall, heavy glass with vanilla ice cream at the bottom, hot chocolate syrup dripping down the sides, thick whipped cream on top, and a bright red cherry placed perfectly at the peak. So perfect you almost didn't want to disturb it. And then you picked up the spoon, touched the glass, and that sound rang out. A tiny, clear ting, a sound you would hear repeating all around you from every direction. From the next table, from behind you, from the corner of the room. Dozens of spoons hitting glass in the same space, creating a background noise you never realized was special until it was gone, and around you were other families. A young couple with 2 little kids fighting over the spoon. A group of teenagers who had just finished their Little League game still in uniform. An older couple sharing a milkshake, and no one was in a hurry. No one got up right after finishing because this wasn't a place you came to eat and leave. This was a place you stayed. Talked some more, ordered one more thing just because you could, and sometimes in the middle of all that, the lights would dim a little when a birthday cake was brought out, candles already lit, and the server set it down and said, "Happy birthday," and the whole table started singing, not because anyone asked, but because that's what always happened in places like this. And you might not remember what that cake tasted like, but you remember the faces of the people around you. You remember the laughter. You remember the feeling of belonging to something. And that's what Friendly's did better than anywhere else. Because it never just sold ice cream. It sold time. It sold moments. It sold the feeling that you didn't have to rush. And if you think back, you realize you didn't go there because you were hungry. You went there after school, after a long day, after a ball game, or just because it was Sunday night and your family wanted to do something together, and many years later when you try to remember, you might not recall what you ordered, what it cost, or what year it was, but you remember clearly who sat across from you in that booth. You remember the little conversations that didn't seem important at the time, but later became everything. That was Friendly's. Not just a restaurant, but a place where American families sat together longer than necessary just to be with each other a little bit more. Now here's how it all began, and how two brothers from Springfield turned a 5-cent ice cream counter during hard times into one of the most iconic family restaurant chains in America. Everything started in 1935 in Springfield when two brothers Esperes, Presley Blake and Curtis Blake, opened a small ice cream counter during the Great Depression, a time when nearly 25% of the American workforce was unemployed, and even the smallest expenses had to be carefully considered. And right in that context, they sold ice cream cones for just 5 cents, the equivalent of about $1 today. A price low enough that even a struggling family could still give their child a small moment of joy, and that was how it all began. Not with a plan for national expansion, but with a very simple idea that if you could make someone smile on a bad day, they would come back. And the name Friendly's wasn't a carefully researched marketing campaign, but simply a straightforward way of saying what they wanted to do, to serve customers in the friendliest way possible. And the Blake brothers didn't stand behind a complicated operation. They stood right behind the counter, scooping ice cream themselves, talking directly to customers, remembering the names of regulars, remembering that this kid liked vanilla while the other always ordered chocolate and then switched to strawberry at the last minute. And in the late 1930s, amid a still struggling America, they built something many big businesses took decades to achieve: customer loyalty. Families who returned not just because it was cheap, but because they felt genuinely welcomed. And then when World War II ended in 1945, the American economy entered a powerful growth period. The middle class began to expand. Suburbs sprang up around major cities, and young families started looking for places they could go together after work, after school, on weekends, and Friendly's, which by then had a solid foundation, began to grow from its original single store into a small regional chain, and then from a small chain into a steadily expanding system. And from around 1945 to 1960, the number of stores increased steadily each year, not in big leaps, but through a simple strategy of opening a new store once the existing one was doing well. And each new store kept the same core elements: red booths, ice cream menu, relaxed atmosphere. And in the process, they realized something important: that if they wanted families to stay longer, they needed more than just ice cream. So they began adding burgers, sandwiches, fries, simple items that turned Friendly's from an ice cream counter into a real family restaurant where you could eat dinner and then stay for dessert. And that combination created the perfect model for post-war America, where cars had become common, where families could drive to a familiar spot, eat, talk, and not feel rushed to leave quickly. And by the 1960s, Friendly's had expanded to hundreds of locations, mainly concentrated in states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, becoming a familiar part of daily life for millions of people. And in the late 1960s, they took another important step by putting their ice cream products into supermarkets, allowing customers to bring a piece of Friendly's home, which helped the brand extend its reach beyond the physical restaurant space. And by the early 1970s, was no longer just a growing business, it had become a habit, a part of the weekly routine, the default destination after school, after work, on Sunday nights. And by the end of the 1970s, the number of stores had passed the 500 mark, large enough to cover the Northeast, but still small enough to keep that familiar feeling, and that was their peak. But also the point where things began to change. Not all at once and with no single big event marking the end, but through a series of small shifts that almost no one noticed at the time. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as America began to move faster, as time became more precious, as fast food models grew strong, and then fast casual in the early 2000s, when names like Panera Bread and Chipotle started redefining how Americans ate: faster, more convenient, more flexible. And Friendly's, built on staying and taking time, began to fall out of step. Its stores, many of which hadn't been updated in years, started to look dated. Its service model no longer fit a new generation of customers, and financial pressure began to appear, leading to difficult decisions and eventually filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2011. A milestone showing that a restaurant chain once iconic for its slow pace and family connection could no longer find its place in a world that was moving faster than ever. By the end of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, Friendly's was operating more than 500 restaurants, a number large enough to make it one of the biggest family dining chains in the Northeast United States. But what mattered more was how those stores existed in everyday life. Because if you drove through Massachusetts, Rhode Island, or Connecticut in 1982, you would almost certainly see at least one Friendly's sign along the way, usually on the corner of a small shopping plaza next to a big parking lot. The neon lights coming on as the sky began to darken, and that repeated from town to town. Not a loud expansion, but a steady presence so constant you didn't have to look for it. You just drove by and it was there, and in that era, Friendly's wasn't a choice, it was the default choice, especially for kids. Because if your birthday fell any time between 1975 and 1988 in this area, it was very likely you celebrated it at a Friendly's with an ice cream cake brought to the table, candles lit, and a group just big enough to make you feel the day was truly special. And it wasn't by accident that the product became iconic, because Friendly's understood one thing very clearly: that kids don't remember the price or the menu, but they remember the moment when the whole table looks at them and sings happy birthday. And those very moments turned the chain into part of collective memory. And not just birthdays, but ordinary evenings too. Evenings when your parents didn't want to cook. Evenings after work and after school, when the whole family got in the car and drove to a familiar place where you could sit for hours without anyone hurrying you to leave. Where you could order a main meal, then a sundae, then maybe another one, and no one asked why. Because that's just what people did there. And in a world before the internet, before smartphones, before people started looking at screens more than at each other, the booths at Friendly's became one of the few places where conversations happened fully. Where parents asked their kids about school and actually listened to the answers, where stories were told from beginning to end without being interrupted by a notification or a call. And it was also the place where many people had their first dates. Meetings where you didn't have to try too hard to impress, because the space did the hardest part. It created comfort. It made everything feel a little easier. And you could sit across from someone, share a milkshake with 2 straws, talk about things that didn't seem important but stayed with you forever. And if you look at the whole picture, you see a common pattern repeating. Every town had a Friendly's. Every family had been there. Every kid had at least one memory tied to a table, a seat, a scoop of ice cream, and that repetition created Friendly's real scale, not just more than 500 stores, but millions of moments replayed the same way day after day, year after year. And signature items like the Jim Dandy sundae with its multiple layers of ice cream, toppings, and whipped cream stacked high wasn't just food, it was a ritual. Something placed in the middle of the table for everyone to look at, share, and sometimes fight over the last bite. And that was how Friendly's moved beyond being a business and became part of American culture, especially in the pre-internet era, when physical shared experiences were still at the center of social life. And if you had to sum it all up in one sentence, it would be that this was the place where America once sat together, slowed down, and shared small moments that no one thought were important at the time but became the things people remembered most later. And what's remarkable is that all of this happened naturally without any marketing campaign creating it or slogan forcing it. It happened because everything was designed the right way at the right time for the needs of a society looking for connection. But like everything built for a specific moment, it began to feel pressure when that moment changed. The change didn't happen overnight. There was no single day when everything suddenly stopped. Instead, it started very slowly in the late 1980s, almost unnoticed at the time, as America entered a new phase where time began to feel scarcer, where more households had both parents working, where kids' schedules became packed with school, sports, and extracurricular activities. And at the same time, new models appeared and grew rapidly, especially fast food chains like McDonald's, which had existed before, but entered strong growth in the late 1980s with thousands of locations nationwide, offering a very different promise than Friendly's: faster, more convenient, and most importantly, better suited to a life that was speeding up. And that gradually changed how Americans thought about eating, because where a dinner might once stretch for an hour or more in a booth, now it could be done in 15 or 20 minutes. And that wasn't just convenience, but an adjustment to the way life was working. And in that context, Friendly's began facing a problem it couldn't solve quickly because its entire model was built on customers staying longer, not leaving faster. And as customers started having less time, the very advantage that had been its greatest strength became its weakness. And throughout the early 1990s, these signs became clearer, not immediately in financial reports, but in small details. Booths no longer as full on Tuesday nights, families no longer staying to order extra dessert, empty tables appearing in hours that used to be busy. And meanwhile, customer expectations were also changing. They started wanting more not just in speed but in space, design, and overall feel. And here, Friendly's began falling behind because many of its stores built in the 1960s and 1970s hadn't been significantly upgraded in years. The booths were still there but no longer felt fresh. The tables were still the same but no longer as comfortable. The fluorescent lights started to look colder. The space began to feel outdated compared to new chains appearing with more modern, brighter, cleaner designs. And this wasn't a big problem right away, but it accumulated over time. And when a family had more choices, they started weighing options. They started asking whether they should spend an hour at a familiar but dated place or 20 minutes at somewhere new, fast, and convenient. And the answer didn't always lean toward Friendly's anymore. And what's notable is the company didn't completely fail to notice this, but they didn't change fast enough, strongly enough, or thoroughly enough to keep up, because to change, they would have to change the very thing that made them who they were, and that was a difficult problem many long-established brands have faced. And meanwhile, new models kept developing. Not just fast food, but fast casual beginning to emerge in the late 1990s, where customers could have a better experience than fast food, but faster than a traditional restaurant. And all of this happened while Friendly's tried to maintain the way it had operated for decades. And the result was that the core experience that had once made it special began to weaken. Not because it no longer had value, but because the world around it had changed. And when you walked into a Friendly's around 1995, you still saw the red booths. You still saw the familiar menu. You could still order a sundae like in 1980, but the feeling was no longer exactly the same. Not because anything was obviously wrong, but because something was missing, a sense of energy, a freshness, a feeling that the place was still moving forward with you. Into the early 2000s, the small cracks that had built up over the previous decade finally became clear breaks as a new wave in the restaurant industry emerged and completely redefined how Americans consumed food. Especially the rise and explosion of the fast casual model with names like Panera Bread and Chipotle, brands that promised something Friendly's couldn't provide. Near fast food speed but with better quality and atmosphere, and this happened at the exact time when American consumer behavior was changing rapidly, when time became a more precious resource than ever, when families could no longer spend an hour sitting in a booth like before, when kids had denser school schedules and parents had longer work hours. And meanwhile, technology began to seep into every aspect of life, with the internet becoming more widespread in the late 1990s and early 2000s, paving the way for online ordering services and then food delivery, a trend that would explode in the following decade with platforms like Grubhub in 2004 and later Uber Eats in 2014. And all these changes created an environment where convenience was no longer an advantage, but a basic requirement. And that was exactly where Friendly's started getting caught between two worlds. Not fast enough to compete with fast food, not fresh and flexible enough to compete with fast casual, and no longer different enough to make customers choose it over other options. And this showed clearly in the numbers as revenue began to stall and then decline throughout the 2000s, while operating costs kept rising, especially labor and ingredients. And many stores began performing below expectations, creating growing financial pressure. And by 2007, as the global financial crisis began to form its impact quickly spread to the restaurant industry as consumers cut back on non-essential experiences, and Friendly's, built around long meals and unhurried moments, became one of the easiest things to drop from a family's budget trying to save money, and the downward spiral began to accelerate. Declining revenue led to cost cuts. Cost cuts led to worse experiences. Worse experiences led to customers returning less often, and fewer customers pulled revenue down further. A cycle that once started was very hard to reverse. And on October 5, 2011, the company officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. A move that allowed restructuring, but also meant admitting the old model no longer worked. And right after that, more than 60 stores were closed almost immediately, with thousands of employees losing their jobs. And many communities realized for the first time that a place they had considered a permanent part of life could disappear. And although the company tried to restructure and continue operating afterward, the core problems remain because the issue wasn't the menu or the quality of the ice cream, but the change in the world around it. And in the years that followed, the number of stores continued to shrink from more than 500 at its peak, down to around 200 in the mid-2010s, and kept decreasing after that while competitors continued to expand, improve, and adapt. And what's notable is Friendly's never completely disappeared, but it gradually became invisible, no longer the first choice, no longer the default. And in an industry where presence in customers' minds is everything, becoming invisible is almost the same as not existing. And if you look back at the entire process, you see this wasn't a sudden failure or a single bad decision, but the result of many factors piling up over time. From shifts in consumer behavior to the emergence of new business models, economic pressures, and the inability to adapt quickly enough. And all of it leads to a very simple but hard to accept conclusion that Friendly's didn't lose because its ice cream was no longer good, or because it didn't know how to run a restaurant, but because the world it was built to exist in, a world where families had time to sit together, where a meal could stretch for hours, where small moments were valued more than convenience, that world had changed. And when that foundation disappeared, everything built on it began to shake until it was no longer solid enough to stand. Today, if you drive through the Northeast United States, you can still come across a few Friendly signs still lit up, but that number has dropped to only around more than 100 stores nationwide as of the early 2020s. A sharp decline compared to more than 500 locations at its peak at the end of the 1970s, and most of the remaining stores are concentrated in familiar states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, places where the brand was once an indispensable part of local life. And although the restaurant footprint has shrunk significantly, Friendly's is not completely vanished because the brand still exists in another form: ice cream tubs placed in supermarket freezers. Familiar names like vanilla, chocolate, or versions inspired by classic sundaes, and you can buy them at a grocery store, bring them home, open the lid, and eat. But that experience is nothing like sitting in a booth, nothing like waiting for an employee to bring out the ice cream, nothing like sharing a moment with someone else. And that is the biggest difference between what remains and what has been lost, because when you walk into a Friendly's today, if you can find one still operating, you immediately notice that everything looks familiar, but the feeling is not. The booths are still there, the menu still has the old names, you can still order a sundae like in 1985. But the space is no longer as full as before. There is no longer the noise of dozens of families at once, no longer the feeling that you are part of something bigger. And sometimes you might see an older customer sitting alone in the corner, looking around as if searching for something they can't name, maybe a memory, maybe a feeling. And that is when you realize the difference between memory and reality doesn't lie in the big details, but in the small ones, the sounds, the silences, the conversations that no longer happen the same way. And in the end, if you pause for a moment and think about it, you realize this story isn't really about a restaurant chain, but about a way of life that has changed. And if you ever sat in a booth with your family, if you ever shared a sundae with 2 spoons, if you ever had a birthday ice cream cake brought out with candles and singing, if you ever stayed longer than you planned just because you didn't want to leave, then you understand it. You understand that places like that don't just sell food, they hold on to moments. And when those moments are gone, you don't really lose a restaurant, you lose a piece of time you can't get back, because in the end, you don't remember the ice cream. You remember the person who sat with you. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories about brands that once shaped an entire generation. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.